Good day. As the Taliban continues to advance in Afghanistan, the latest reports which I've heard speak of it capturing important border crossings between Afghanistan and Pakistan, even as it consolidates its control of Afghanistan's border with Iran. The pace of diplomacy continues to intensify. One thing that has happened recently is that the Taliban have now confirmed that the Taliban delegation which visited Moscow, as well as engaging in other diplomatic contacts and discussions with the Russians, which I discussed in a recent video, also apparently asked the Russians to lobby at the UN Security Council for sanctions which were imposed on the Taliban to be lifted. And apparently the Russians were receptive to the idea. Well, we will see what happens, and we will see what the other members of the Security Council think about that. Those will, of course, include countries like Britain, France, and the United States. But in any event, what that shows is the extent of Taliban engagement with the Russians at this time. Moreover, at the same time that the Taliban delegation was in Moscow, in fact, just after it left it, one of its heads, Suhail Shaheen, on Wednesday, described China as a friend of Afghanistan and gave public assurances that China would not need to be concerned about Afghanistan, a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, become a base for jihadi groups to infiltrate into China and in particular into Xinjiang province. These were some of the words that he used. People from other countries who want to use Afghanistan as a site to launch attacks against other countries, we have made a commitment that we will not allow them, whether it's an individual or entity, against any country, including China. And as I said, Suhail Shaheen, went out of his way to speak of China as a friend. And it is indeed China's interactions with the Taliban, which I propose to discuss in this program. Now, I ought to say that so far as I am aware, there have been no direct discussions or contacts between the Chinese and the Taliban up to now, though it's likely that some talks have taken place behind the scenes between the Taliban and lower-level officials. As I have discussed in the past, a feature of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is that the Chinese are usually content to stand back and let the Russians do the heavy lifting in the diplomatic sphere, with the Russians, of course, always keeping China, Beijing, informed of what they're doing. Nonetheless, the Chinese have now been making various public statements, and they all seem to indicate a willingness to cooperate with the Taliban, though upon various conditions. One of those conditions, and it's the obvious one, is that the Taliban does not allow jihadi groups to infiltrate into Xinjiang province. I should say that there is a narrow border between China and Afghanistan, and it would be the obvious route for jihadi fighters from a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan to enter Xinjiang province. But apparently the Chinese feel that it is fairly easy to close, and they're confident that their security forces can control the border and intercept any attempts to infiltrate into Xinjiang province from Afghanistan by that route. But of course, other routes also exist, and it's conceivable that if the Taliban were to go back on all its promises and were to allow itself to become a place of refuge, a safe haven for jihadi groups, then they could infiltrate into Xinjiang province by going through Afghanistan, from Afghanistan through the various Central Asian states and infiltrating into Xinjiang province through there. But having said that, the Chinese for the moment appear to believe that they have the situation under some kind of control. But we learn from Global Times that Chinese experts, and now I'm quoting directly, have warned that though the Taliban's stance on the issue of jihadi groups sounds positive, China is uncertain about the extent to which the Taliban would be able to fulfill these promises. Now, this is an important point because, of course, it should be stressed that China is not doubting here the Taliban's sincerity. It just doubts its ability to control Afghanistan in that kind of way that would ensure that Afghanistan under Taliban rule would not become a safe haven for terrorist groups in the way that it became in the 1990s. And what we learn is that there have been now a number of discussions and points made by no less a person than Wang Yi, who is a member of China's State Council, but who is also China's foreign minister. And Wang Yi is reported to have said that the Taliban should realize, and again I'm quoting from Global Times, should realize the responsibility it bears for the Afghan nation and make a clean break with all terrorist forces and return to the mainstream of Afghan politics. And then we go on to read from Global Times that Wang made the remarks during a joint press conference with Tajik Foreign Minister Sirajuddin Mukhriddin following their talks in Dushanbe, capital city of Tajikistan. Now, Wang visited Turkmenistan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan this week and is scheduled to attend the meeting of foreign ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Afghanistan Contact Group. And then we learn further that the SCO, that's Shanghai Cooperation Afghanistan Contact Group meeting, has now been elevated to the foreign ministerial level for the first time since it was established in 2005, and the Chinese observers note this as indicating the urgency of the Afghan situation and the great attention and consensus of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries with a view to eventually integrating Afghanistan into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So Wang Yi's comments were made in connection with this, and I discussed in that previous program, which I did when I discussed Russia's interactions with Afghanistan, that one of the objectives that the Russians and the Chinese will be pursuing in the talks with Afghanistan and with the Taliban is to try to integrate Afghanistan, including a Taliban-led Afghanistan, into the Eurasian structures, first and foremost the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as part of the Greater Eurasia One Belt, One Road strategy that the Russians and the Chinese are pursuing. And it seems that this is very much the focus also, not just of the Russians, but of the Chinese. And that, of course, should not surprise anyone. And we have learned further from the Chinese, from Global Times specifically, that the Chinese are indeed interested in working with a stable Taliban-led Afghanistan. And these are some of the things that Global Times has said about Afghanistan in a recent editorial, and which undoubtedly reflect the opinions of the Chinese government. Afghanistan has its inherent interest pattern and cultural traditions and is widely regarded as the graveyard of empires. Over the past more than 40 years, the former Soviet Union and the United States have both suffered a failure in the country. China will never enter Afghanistan their way, and this will ensure that China will never become the third country after the Soviet Union and the United States. Advocacy of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence is not an empty slogan of China, but a true motto for China's handling of complicated international issues. Thus, the 5 principles have effectively guided China's diplomacy and have enabled us to skillfully deal with even some of the most difficult issues. The stability of Afghanistan bears major interests and concerns for China. We are definitely willing to help Afghanistan achieve peace and stability as soon as possible and make every effort to promote talks and peace. Once the situation in Afghanistan allows Chinese companies to invest in the country, both Chinese state-owned and private capital will be very active. Many of China's neighbouring countries have formed those close economic and trade relations with China, and Afghanistan will be no exception in the long run. So that is, in effect, an offer to Afghanistan, to the Taliban, of Chinese economic assistance for the reconstruction of Afghanistan, provided the Taliban does 2 things. Firstly, forswear terrorism. Secondly, re-enter the Afghan mainstream. Now, what I think the Chinese mean by that is a follow-up of what I was discussing in my previous video, the points that the Russians have been making to the Taliban, which is that if the Taliban establish itself, as it did in the 1990s, as a sectarian, Pushtu dominated fundamentalist organization, then it will fail to achieve peace in Afghanistan or full control over the country. It needs to broaden itself and to work with the other communities, Afghan communities and groups, in order to establish a full and lasting peace and stability in the country. And as I discussed also in that other program, the Taliban themselves seem to understand this. We hear from them constant assurances that that is their intention, and it seems for the moment to be their practice when they enter Tajik regions and apparently allow Afghan troops to, when they give up arms, to hand over their weapons, and in some cases, apparently the Taliban has paid to let them go home. So this is what the Chinese and the Russians want. They want a peaceful, stable, inclusive Afghanistan, and they want the Taliban to broaden its appeal, to accept the need to work with other Afghan communities. And if the Taliban does that, then China will be prepared to invest heavily in Afghanistan's economy and help build up Afghanistan, but it would want to do that as part of the Greater Eurasia Project, in other words, as part of the Belt and Road Project and as part of the greater program for Eurasian integration, which the Russians and the Chinese are jointly pursuing. So that is what the Chinese are saying, and they're saying it publicly. And so far, the Taliban appear to be receptive. As I said, the Taliban have given assurances that they will not allow Afghanistan to become a safe haven for terrorist groups, that they see China as a friend, that they will not pose any kind of threat or security problem for any of the neighbouring states, that they want peace in Afghanistan and they want stability there. and presumably, and by implication, they will honour these commitments for Afghanistan to work towards integration with the SCO, with the Russian Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that is the Chinese policy, and that is the Taliban's statements that they will do it. And it's also, of course, as I discussed in that previous program, what the Russians want to see happen. Will it happen? Well, I understand the skepticism that many people feel. I understand also that there are probably very hardline and fanatical people within the Taliban itself, people who would probably want to return to some of the policies which we saw in the 1990s and which led to Al-Qaeda becoming established there. And it's also possible, and indeed likely, that the Taliban will struggle to do some of the other things that it has promised to do. It may find it difficult to work with non-Pashto communities, despite the efforts it is making at the moment. It may also find it extremely difficult, as I discussed in that other program, to actually eradicate drugs production in that country. All of this is uncertain. I have no, overconfidence about the likely outcomes here. I accept fully that things may not turn out for the best. But this does seem to me to be a possible way forward, provided the Taliban, the Russians, the Chinese, and by the way, the Iranians are also actively interested in what goes on in Afghanistan, as of course is Pakistan and other countries, provided these all work together and in a realistic way and act in their collective best interests, then it is possible that we could be finally on the brink of peace in Afghanistan and economic development there of a sort that we have not seen ever happen in Afghanistan in its past. Let us hope so. I would finish this program by making a few observations by repeating a few observations that Global Times has made in its editorial, from which I extensively quoted. The sudden withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan has met with a lot of domestic opposition. In many people's view, the so-called withdrawal shows that the US cannot hold on to fight in Afghanistan anymore. The US has failed, and it was forced to flee in a hurry. When the US launched the Afghan war 20 years ago, it was full of confidence and was determined to win. But soon the US found that it was stuck in a quagmire, repeatedly adjusting its war goals. US troops were facing the Taliban, which has almost no foreign aid, but at the cost of more than $1 trillion and more than 2,000 American soldiers' lives, the US just could not handle it. The Taliban mainly relied on its own strength to achieve a similar ending like the Vietnam War. This is a portrayal of the current decline in the US's national strength. The US-Iraq war eventually led to a pro-Iran regime, but Afghanistan's future is uncertain. The US seems to be particularly fond of wars, but it has left an unfinished, messy project in almost every war. Now the Taliban sees Washington as an enemy, and the Afghan government sees it as a selfish escapee. All of Washington's preaching of the so-called victory of this war is to flatter itself. Now, I have to say, again, obviously there is a propagandistic element in these comments, but there is a great deal of truth in them. Firstly, the comparison the Global Times is making between the defeat of the United States in Vietnam and the defeat of the United States in Afghanistan is a pointed and incisive one. The United States was defeated in Vietnam by a powerful North Vietnamese army, heavily equipped by the Soviet Union and China. The Taliban, by contrast, has managed to defeat the United States in Afghanistan all by itself without receiving any kind of support from anyone, at least not to anything like the same degree. It's had some help, possibly, from Pakistan, but no one can compare the kind of aid the Taliban has received from Pakistan with what the North Vietnamese used to get from the Chinese and the Russians. I would add that the Taliban has had to do with far less than the Mujahideen did in Afghanistan when they fought the Soviet army in the 1980s, and in those days had the full backing, indeed the enthusiastic backing, of the United States, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Pakistan. Anyway, so that's a point the Chinese are making. Whether they're right to say that it shows the extent of US decline is another matter, but it is an incisive and telling point, and one which perhaps Americans ought to consider and think about. But far more important is the other point that the Chinese are making in this Global Times editorial, which is that the United States enters countries confident of achieving grandiose objectives of completely restructuring those countries, and it leaves these countries in an unfinished mess. We've seen that happen now in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and no doubt we will see it happen again in other places too. And it leaves that mess to be sorted out by other people. Well, given how much and how completely the United States has failed, and specifically in Afghanistan on this occasion, perhaps this other course that the Chinese and the Russians are trying to forge in their discussions with the Taliban, maybe those will succeed where the American methods failed. And let us hope they do, because unlike the American methods, which were, to be straightforward about it, violent and coercive, these are diplomatic and constructive. I once said in a television program that where the Romans made a desert and called it peace, in accordance with what the Roman historian Tacitus once said, the United States today all too often creates chaos and calls it freedom. And we've seen that happen now in far too many places. But a Taliban-led Afghanistan would not be a free Afghanistan by any definition of the word that we would understand in the West. But perhaps, just possibly, it might see an escape from chaos. Just possibly, the wars in Afghanistan, which were launched way back in the 1970s, when the United States took the fatal decision to arm the Mujahideen against the Afghan government and eventually the Soviets, maybe those wars will finally end. Maybe the chaos that Afghanistan has experienced over those long years, the violence, the sectarian periods of sectarian rule, the massive explosion of opium production and heroin smuggling, maybe all that will finally come to an end. Maybe the Afghan people will finally, as a result of all of these measures, all of these talks, discussions, negotiations that are currently underway, maybe they will enjoy finally a period of sustained stability and peace. And maybe, just maybe, Afghanistan will be integrated in institutions, admittedly Eurasian institutions rather than Western ones, and maybe it will experience an economic rebirth with Chinese economic aid and perhaps other countries like Russia and Iran establishing economic and trade links with Afghanistan also. That, at least, is something which I hope for, and I think all people of goodwill should hope for. Maybe it will not come to pass. Maybe the Taliban, like other Afghan groups and like the Taliban before in the 1990s, will squander its victory and will relapse back into sectarian policies and fundamentalism and terrorism and the policies of jihad, which have brought Afghanistan nothing but misery and war. I accept that is possible. But why not hope? And it seems to me that Afghanistan, on the brink of the Taliban's victory there, may be closer to peace now, and perhaps a peaceful and even by its standards, a prosperous future than it has ever been, certainly since the Afghan wars began in the 1970s. I hope so, and I think we all should. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel, which you will find links to under this video. And please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, ODYSEE, and especially SuperU and Locals. And please also support us to the extent that you feel you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And please, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and also check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for listening to me today on this program about Afghanistan. I suspect I'm going to have to do more programs of this sort about Afghanistan for a while yet, until we see more clearly where this war is going and how it is ending. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day, and I look forward to you joining me again soon. And thank you again for joining me today.